So our job today is to talk a little bit about our work here in values and to think about these different families of values that were introduced in today's readings, and then to prepare the way to talk about religious ethics. I want to begin by going back to this issue of egoism that came up in the quiz. And a number of you pointed to psychological egoism and were wondering whether this isn't true, or the truth of egoism is psychological egoism. So psychological egoism is just mentioned very much in passing by Weston. He doesn't go into it, but it's important to emphasize that psychological egoism is actually demonstrably false. So psychological egoism is the argument that we are naturally devoted to ourselves, and we are concerned, we are selfish, it's just who we are as individuals. So there's no truth to this at all, and it's not a correct description of human behavior, and you can demonstrate this by looking at all kinds of current human beings and human behaviors. The fact is that human beings do not always choose in their own self-interest, either because of altruism, choosing for somebody else, or simply because they choose bad things for themselves. It's also not even a correct description of animal behavior. So when we look at animals, everything from chimpanzees and apes all the way down to rats and mice, we see lots of cooperative behavior. So evolutionarily speaking, we need cooperative behavior. Then if you're going to argue from nature, we are designed by nature to cooperate and to work as groups. So psychological egoism is demonstrably false. Now, from psychological egoism, we get an argument for ethical egoism. And some of you may be fans of Ayn Rand's work, for example, Atlas Shrugged and such. And there is a very powerful argument she makes there for a kind of ethical egoism. But ethical egoism as a theory simply does not work. It is, in fact, required that ethical egoism has people who are not ethical egoists. You can't have a society of ethical egoists who are primarily looking out for themselves, because society itself must continue to run somehow. Ethical egoism simply becomes an excuse for selfish behavior, for personal ego-centered behavior that then assumes that there are all these dupes out there who will continue to respond as if society was important. And that allows you, as the ethical egoist, to go and continue your selfish behavior. So it's not a good description of how societies function. It simply cannot work if everybody were to do it. The confusion comes then with a political theory called libertarianism, which sometimes gets confused with egoism. And you see this very often in public discussions or discussions on the internet. In fact, libertarianism is not consistent with egoism. They are not the same, and they don't do the same things. Because libertarians are interested in politics. They are ultimately interested in society and promoting a society, one that really values liberty. And ethical egoists are not interested in society. If they were interested in society, they wouldn't be egoists. So it's not the same thing, and they, in fact, are inconsistent. If you're a libertarian, you not only are interested in your own liberty, you're interested in others' liberty, and you have a duty to preserve other people's liberties. So a libertarian is very strongly supportive of individual liberties, both for oneself and for others. So you see, a libertarian fits into our definition of ethics because libertarians are, in fact, concerned for others as well as for themselves. So I just wanted to clarify that because I know these are very popular theories that are out there, and a real warning that egoism can be a trap and a self-fulfilling prophecy, as Weston puts it. Again, there is a certain truth to egoism. The self is important, and there are times when self-care is necessary. But this does not mean that the rest of society is unimportant in any way. So moving back to our objectives, both for this week as well as for last week, that last week we were focused on understanding what ethical thinking was and how it offers ourselves opportunities for improving the world and improving ourselves. So that very general but important argument about the place of ethics in the world. And of course, we read some of the pieces by Alice Walker and Ted Karasote thinking about these categories of self and other and how we might think about our place in the world. Today, we're going to try to focus this diversity of ethical values and think about ways that there are certain similarities, ways of grouping ethical values together. And we also want to focus on the special case of religious-based ethical values. And we'll be doing that not only on Friday with our discussion with Reverend Ben Weidman, but also next week as we delve more deeply into Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si. And then we are also, after we deal with Laudato Si, going to be addressing the questions of facts and ethics as we lead up then to our final preparation for our project in this unit, which is the discussion project. So this diversity of values, as Anthony Weston points out, can be thought of as being different values for different purposes. And indeed, as we think about aesthetics, the appreciation of art and beauty, there are certain things that are valued that are different than values we have for scientific or instrumental purposes. So as we think about the reason of why we want to do certain things, then we value different things in that process of what we're doing altogether. So we can group up values in this way, and then in this sense, we can separate out moral values. What moral values do for us is to give voice to basic needs and legitimate expectations. So you see, again, we're building on this fundamental definition of ethics to do with basic needs and legitimate expectations. And how do we express that? How do we give voice to those needs and expectations? Those are, in fact, the values that we're talking about. So when we think about moral values in relationship to these other values, we see that there are some things that are quite in common. So taking care, then, is something that we find in lots of different groups of values. In terms of aesthetics and in art, we have to take care in representing something and creating something of beauty. It's often the craftsmanship that goes into that, the detail that is so important to create objects of beauty and enjoyment, pieces of art, pieces of music. All of this then is part of that kind of taking care. And that same sort of attention to detail is important in science, of course. It's not the same. It's very different to write a piece of music as opposed to analyzing the gases coming from an ice core. And yet we have a similar value of taking care, attention to detail, pride in one's own craft and care and producing a kind of expertise. No less in morals, right? As we think about moral values and moral issues such as climate change, we also have to take care, pay close attention to detail, develop a kind of expertise. So you see that you can have a single value of pride in one's work and attention to detail that then carries through in these different areas. So that's certainly possible. And when we think about instrumental values, what makes a good tool, what is a valuable thing for us in producing all kinds of woodwork or cabinetry or such, we can also think about moral values in this way, because a good moral value is one that's effective in allowing us to hear other people, but also to express ourselves. So to make the changes in the world that we want to see, what are the values that are going to be good at that? And so this diversity of values helps us to both contrast with moral values, but also to think about what are moral values in a different sort of light. Now, today we're focusing on these families of values. And of course, philosophers have been pondering the issues of values and ethics for literally thousands of years. Remember our key words here, that in this kind of philosophical analysis, we're trying to be systematic, we're trying to be critical, and also creative. We want to, this is the whole purpose of this kind of, in some ways it's nitpicking, right? We're creating very tight definitions and things that may in general be the same. We want to look very critically and very carefully and see if we can systematically tease out differences one from another, because that's how we learn. That's how we learn to see these small differences that might be tremendously important to people. But the creative aspect of this is also important, because it should allow us to think about well-worn ethical issues in entirely new ways, and to allow us to creatively apply our own experiences to new situations. So one of the oldest of these families of values is rules and rulemaking. Anthony Weston calls this the ethics of persons, and here he's focusing on the notion expressed by Immanuel Kant, an 18th century German philosopher, who talked about the individual person as being incommensurable. You can't compare it to anything else, and that you can never treat a person as a means to another end, only as an end in and of themselves. What this comes down to is thinking about the if you will, the moral lay of the land before we undertake any action. So according to this rule-based thinking, or deontological thinking, we have rules that exist in advance of any kind of ethical problem. So for example, it is always wrong to murder, categorically. We can take this as a principle across every culture and time and see that it's always wrong to murder. We might think of some others. It's always wrong to torture, for example. When you torture a person, you're using that person as a means to the end of information. So your end goal is information, and you're literally using a person, you're causing them pain so that they give you this information. So that again is a violation of these universalizable principles. We don't have to examine torture, we don't have to think about it before we do it. Is this kind of torture better than that kind of torture? No, we don't need to think about any of that, because it's always wrong. It's categorically wrong in this understanding. So with, again, this ethics of persons, we come into any ethical situation with fundamental principles, fundamental rules that may not be violated in any way. In contrast, the ethics of happiness, in its pure form, doesn't come in with any rules at all. That every situation needs to be recalculated and thought about. In this particular situation, maybe it's okay to murder, especially if you know you're going to save the lives of many, many more people. So that kind of calculus, in fact, argues against the ethics of the person, and we're instead of saying people are incommensurable, saying no, you can actually compare and contrast. So, one person is worth more than 100 people, for example. That's obvious according to the ethics of happiness. And so these words, utility is a very strange word, and utilitarianism then becomes an expression of this. This is one of the reasons why Anthony Weston does not talk about deontology and utilitarianism, which some of you have learned in other classes, because they're outdated and sort of confusing words. The seeking after happiness, after pleasure, is much more clear and obvious as to what this is aiming at. What I want you to think about is that whereas the ethics of the person has a set of rules in advance of the problem, the ethics of happiness addresses every problem as it comes and considers what comes after. So there is, if you will, this moral calculus about the outcome of any action. And if that outcome is better for all concerned, then it's not only okay, it is the right thing to do. So in the ethics of happiness, it's not a matter of justifying murder. It's saying that in a particular case, it's possible that murder is the right thing to do. Not something that is just acceptable, but really the right thing to do. It's the right thing to murder if you know that by that murder, you're actually going to be preserving, say, 100 other lives. And this leads to these awful, tired, very worn examples like the trolley example and the cave example. Some of you who have taken this sort of moral philosophy have gone through those. I find them really difficult and tiresome. And to some extent, they're just so much philosophical mumbo jumbo. But here we want to pay attention to them because it offers us a different way of thinking. And as we'll see, in some ways, it is intuitively the way we address certain issues about climate change. Virtue ethics then takes as its understanding something totally different. It's not necessarily about how you treat persons or the rules that you have. It's not necessarily about what the outcome of any action is. It's first and foremost developing a positive character in the world. Now, the fact is that the word virtue actually comes from the Latin for man. And this is, in a sense, manliness, what it means to be a man in the world. We don't have to accept that, of course. We can expand this to think of character in general. But it is a matter of, we can maybe perhaps think about this in terms of maturity, that there are things that a child might do, might be fully allowed, that then you would not think of as acceptable for an adult to do. So what it means to be an adult, or adulting, if you will, in the world means to have certain characters, certain morals. And this might include things like being truthful to others, being kind to others. These are all virtues. And so the question then for any moral problem is, what would the virtuous person do in this situation? And what would my actions be that would be representing these virtues of kindness and care for others and truth-telling and such? So it's not such that ethics of persons, happiness, or virtue would come to different conclusions about any particular moral issue. In fact, arguably, no matter how you argue it in these different families of values, you still come out with the idea that we should act to prevent damage from climate change, for example. But it's going to be more intuitive for some people to think about this in light of these different ways of grouping values. And a final one that Anthony Weston includes here is the ethics of relationship. So whereas virtue is primarily concerned with me and my development of moral character, relationships is building on the intuition that we have a greater duty to those of us, those who are closer to us than those who are far away. But for example, I have a duty to my son or my wife or my father that's different from my duties to you, my students. I have duties to you, but arguably it would be wrong for me to put one of you up, above my son, for example. So we have this intuition that we owe things to our family members that are different. We do things for our close friends that are different from what we do to a perfect stranger. One of the lessons from the story of the Good Samaritan is that this Samaritan undertook care of a perfect stranger. That is altruism, going above and beyond what we expect. We would expect a person to care for their own, but caring for somebody else is beyond that. So this is the ethics of relationship. This idea that care and caring for others is part of an intuitive sense we have of who is part of our group as opposed to who is part of others, but also that we do have duties of care to others. They just might be different than our duties of care to our family members. Beyond that idea of in-group and out-group, it's just the general attitude toward the notion that care and caring is a fundamental value for some people in the same way that building good character is, or justice is, or duties are to others. And so, again, this is part of being systematic, but also helping us to understand how other people may have very different ethical intuitions than we do. So how then is climate change an ethical issue? I just want to cover this briefly here at the end, and then of course we're going to have a discussion in class. But when we think about duties and obligations, so again, this is the ethics of the person, what justice requires of us, what our duties are toward others. Then here comes this argument that Richard Alley presented to us, that those of us who have benefited the most from fossil fuels and have put the most carbon dioxide into the atmosphere have a duty to others who did not benefit from that and may be suffering even more than we are from rising carbon dioxide levels. So this issue of duties and obligations is important, but also the very fact that we should not treat these other people as a means toward our personal gain. For example, when we talk about the idea that we all need to reduce carbon dioxide levels, is it fair for us to demand this of other people who have not benefited from the burning of fossil fuels? This was the argument in the Kyoto Protocol, some of you may have heard of, that least developed countries should not have a cap on their emissions because it's more important for us to control our own emissions, those of us from wealthy countries, and to allow those least developed countries to develop, and hopefully all of us then eventually to move to a lower carbon footprint. But also in this question of duties and obligations, as we look at climate change in this light, we come up with the question of whether we have a responsibility for past harms. So our duties in this sense are not just to deal with the present or with the future, but also to redress the past, things that we have done that now we recognize as being deeply problematic, or simply to recognize the fact that since the George W. Bush administration, almost 30 years ago, the US government has been promising to do something about carbon dioxide levels and has failed to do that. So there certainly is a responsibility for the past 30 years, and maybe even farther than that, as we look at our failure to respond ethically to climate change. Again, that's something that comes up particularly through the issue of the ethics of the person, or this kind of deontological view. When you look at a utilitarian view, again, this is the ethics of happiness, or really economic thinking, right? We're looking at what is the best outcome for all people, not necessarily what the rules are that were broken, for example. And when we look at the best outcome for others, there of course is a difference, and this always comes up in the ethics of happiness, is how do you perform this calculus? Are you performing this calculus as many economists do, just looking at a 30-year timeline? Or are you taking a much longer timeline and considering harms that may not show up until the end of the century, or indeed much later than that? There's nothing in utilitarian calculus that says that that timeline should be short or should be long. You are welcome to include whatever you think is relevant in your utilitarian calculus. And the question of what kinds of losses you should take into account are really important here. So you might also include issues of fresh water or disease or migration or all other kinds of consequences that you foresee happening. One of the interesting things that happens with this sort of utilitarian calculus is that you can justify almost anything if the situation is dire enough. So back to that horrible example I gave of murder. I'm sorry about that. This is the way these ethical discussions often turn out. You end up entertaining monstrous ideas. But what would it take to justify murdering somebody? What kind of apocalypse would you be preventing? So you prevent the zombie apocalypse, so you just murder this one person. And so the same thing happens with climate change. And this is one of the reasons why I've warned some of you against making arguments about the world being destroyed. Because, well, first of all, it's just not true. The world is not going to be destroyed. It's going to be vastly changed, but not destroyed. And human beings are not all going to die. Their civilization may be vastly changed, and many people will die. But the human being itself will survive in some way or another. The problem is that when we create these apocalyptic scenarios of the entire planet falling apart, we can justify virtually any injustice in the present in order to get to that or prevent that terrible event from happening. This is one of the things that, and you see then here, these two ethical theories really do argue against one another, because with the ethics of duty, obligation, the ethics of the person, you're always concerned not to commit injustices on your way to trying to get to a greater justice. That paying attention to what you're doing along the way is tremendously important, because the fact is you always know the act you're committing. You're never really sure about the consequences that may result from that act. And that question of knowledge, of what you're actually in control of, is a terribly important insight with the ethics of the person. In terms of ethics of relationships, this is something that actually our readings for today focus on. What kinds of relationships? We might, as Leopold and Abby are talking about today, our fundamental relationship might actually be with the land. That this loss of biodiversity for itself may be the relationship that we're most concerned about. But of course, there are also relationships in terms of human civilizations. Climate migration is one that comes immediately to mind, but also the way that climate change exacerbates the current injustices in our society. So this is an important insight from the ethics of relationship that might not come in to our thinking through climate ethics from either the ethics of the person or the ethics of happiness. So again, to some extent, we really need these different ethical perspectives in order to give us a fuller view of what it is that we're facing and to guide us as to how we might act. Now, action on climate change fits into two categories. You'll see these words thrown around. I just want to briefly clarify them, that mitigation in climate change is about preventing future harms. And for those of us in wealthy countries, it has to do with our carbon budget, with fundamentally reducing our greenhouse gas production. But also, who gets the rest of the carbon budget? There's only a certain amount of CO2 we can put into the air in order to keep our temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius. How is that distributed? This is a question that is particularly interesting and important for wealthy countries. For other countries, mitigation and future harms, you have no control over greenhouse gas production. So that's not an important issue. The question really comes down to, will I be able to continue farming on this delta, this lowland territory that's near rising seas? Or when wealthy countries come in and try to build power plants, even green power plants, are they in fact deciding for us what our future should be? So the issues of development and responding to climate change can be very different depending on which kind of background you have. But some argue that mitigation's over, that we really can't do much anymore about this, and maybe it's even unethical to keep focusing on just this issue of trying to convert our power plants to solar and wind. In fact, we have to start addressing the harms. And that means adapting to sea level rise. It could mean moving populations, in some cases, perhaps building some kinds of barriers, but just simply accepting that there are going to be spaces that are uninhabitable. There just today in the news, there were massive floods in Hawaii because of unprecedented rainfall there. These sorts of unprecedented rainfall events are making areas in river valleys and other places that were once prime real estate into uninhabitable land. Of course, the same thing's true for shorelines. We might just have to accept that these areas are uninhabitable, to move on, to focus our resources on preventing future harms and adapting to the climate change that we foresee. Certainly in terms of wildfires and again, these massive rainfall events and hurricanes, that we have to focus on building resilience. There's no better example for this than the disaster in Texas and Louisiana, where some are still suffering from that sudden weird weather cold snap that happened. And what we see here is that infrastructure issues, I mean, again, this is the wealthiest country in the world with these infrastructure issues. Imagine what it's like to live in a country without the resources that the United States has, and how they suffer when these weird weather events hit them. So our readings now, and I hope you have a chance to discuss these a bit in your research pods today. The issues of the human relationship with the land come very much to the fore in both the Leopold and the Edward Abbey readings. I think you might want to see some similarities between Aldo Leopold and the Tao Te Ching. Compare those two, think about that kind of connection. I have to say that I love Edward Abbey's writings. If you don't know him as a writer, it just makes me smile when we get to issues like, if you see any survey stakes, pull them up because these people are out to no good. He is absolutely against any kind of development in desert lands or encroachment on these territories, to the point of being what we call a misanthrope, somebody who is just curmudgeonly to the point of being anti-human. But it's a fascinating view, because what you see here in these stories is his deep relationship to the land, a level of care that really, trying to express these values, work on that a little bit as you're discussing this. What are the values that are important to someone like Edward Abbey? And what can we learn from that perspective? As we get into largely biblical stories for our reading for Friday, I mean, there are some other texts in that reading, but I think the things that will speak most powerfully to you, whether you're a Christian or not, are these different biblical stories that are mentioned there. And I want to point out that reading these texts, and one of the most important points that Weston brings out, is that these texts usually don't have a single way to read them. And the notion of reading a text literally actually is not very common in religious traditions. Far more common is using a story to begin a conversation and begin a discussion. And so one of the things you see actually in the Bible, the sacred text of both Christians and Jews, is that there's not one creation narrative, there are three creation narratives, all of which have a different view about the human relationship to the natural world. In the first of these, the human being is created as the pinnacle of creation after the creation of light and earth and plants and animals, and then finally the human being. I should point out that in this story, the human being is created in the image of God, male and female. God created them. It's always a little surprising to some people. Adam doesn't refer to a man at all in the Bible. Ha'adamah, as it's in the Hebrew, refers to the mud creature. So this is simply the creature that God makes. There's an entirely second story, which is sometimes folded into the first, but it's actually separate, very separate in the Bible itself. And that's the creation of the world by a gardener. And God plants the garden, plants Eden in the east, and then creates Ha'adamah out of the mud, and then from Adam's rib creates Eve. It's a very different view of God, who is not just this ethereal being floating over the void, but is intimately walking and talking and forming with his hands the creatures that will inhabit his world. And then the flood story of Noah and the ark, is absolutely a third creation story. So these different stories have different meanings and are opportunities to think about the world in different ways. And in all of them, however, the human being is at the center. And we have to really question this, that religious traditions often are so human-focused as to render the rest of the world, the non-human world, as an instrument for the activity of a human being. And this is a powerful notion we have of what's the right or natural way to interact with the world. That's one of the reasons why the Leopold reading or the Dada Jing are so surprising to us, because they in fact do not put the human being at the center, but the human being in a much broader context. And the last thing I want to think about in terms of these stories, again, whether biblical or other religious stories, is that they're unenforceable. Like the UN Declaration, there is no army you can talk about heaven and hell being a kind of enforcement, but the fact is that narratives do not necessarily function in a way that laws do, of having something that if you don't do them, you're going to suffer. They respond to us and open things up in terms of perspectives, but also sharing a wisdom of past generations, then passing that wisdom down to future generations. So think about that in your discussions today. I hope that this all recorded pretty well, and that in fact we're going to be able to begin with this lecture. We'll see how things happen. It's always a bit of an experiment in Zoom land. Talk to you soon.